Joining me now is Anne Applebaum. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, a staff writer for The Atlantic, a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the Agora Institute. She's the author of several important books, including Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, Red Famine, Stalin's War on Ukraine, and Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, 1944 to 1956. There may be no one with greater specialty at what is happening here. Anne, thank you for being with us this morning, this evening here in Ukraine. I have to ask you now, a year in, what you see happening as we look at the situation in Ukraine.
So I'm at the Munich Security Conference, which is an annual event. There are Ukrainians, Americans, members of all the NATO alliance here. There is an extraordinary show of solidarity, one that was not at all predicted a year ago. So I was here exactly on this day a year ago, and it was 3 days before the war started. There was doubt. Nobody believed Ukraine would survive. Nobody believed that Zelensky would still be president by now. But here we are. I mean, it's a very, it's a very difficult war to assess because, on the one hand, what's been achieved is so extraordinary and was so unexpected, and yet there is still so much further to go. I mean, this war will end when Russia has understood that it was a mistake. And that means we need to get to that point, and that means Ukraine needs to take back its territory and needs to convince Russia that it can't win, and we aren't quite there yet.
I'm curious about that when you say we aren't quite there yet, because one of the things that Vladimir Putin said a year ago was that one of his stated goals was to stop the expansion of NATO, particularly of Ukraine becoming a NATO country. Since then, two other countries that didn't really have an interest in joining NATO have announced that they'd like to, and that might actually happen. The likelihood of Vladimir Putin invading a NATO country or even sending a missile into a NATO country seems lower now that they've got most of their military in Ukraine right now, but you are saying that message hasn't gotten through. Why is that? Why does Vladimir Putin not look at this and say this is an abject failure for Russia?
So this was never about NATO. That was a lie that he told to fool our security community and to convince us not to help Ukraine. This was always about him. It was about his vision of a reconstructed Soviet Union, of a new Russian empire. And it was also always about his desire to destroy the forces of democracy and liberalism and open society that he saw developing in Ukraine, and which he perceived as a threat to him personally. He's somebody who has a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet Union, for that period, and he's somebody who sees democratic language, democratic activism, and of course the kind of democratic revolution they had in Ukraine as a threat to him. So this has always been about crushing Ukraine and crushing that movement. And he hasn't achieved that. He's attached a lot of his prestige to that. There's a lot of doubt about it around him. We know that the Russian business community and the security community are not 100% behind this war, but he personally believes that his power is connected to winning it. And so he has not yet been convinced that he won't win. And there are back channel conversations, and we know he's not at that stage yet.
So, and that's what I was going to ask you. What is the thing then that convinces him otherwise? Because the world is looking for what's the next step? What's the off-ramp? Is there an off-ramp? Is there an exit for Vladimir Putin? And what does that look like short of taking the territories that he invaded Ukraine to take?
So we're now in a realm of black swan events. We don't really know what's really happening inside the Russian military. You mentioned already the extraordinary casualties, way out of scale, beyond what Russia suffered in the Afghan war that was so devastating, beyond what really anybody can imagine. We're talking about 200,000 casualties, dead and wounded. So he needs to get beyond that. He needs to begin to think about, what will change the situation. Sorry, there's a lot of noise behind me.
Yeah, you're at the Munich Security Conference, an important conference at which the Vice President of the United States has said now that Russia has committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine, something that you have made an important point of discussing. And thank you for your time this morning, as always, or again for us, afternoon and evening. Anne Applebaum is a staff writer at The Atlantic. She is the author of many important books. Some have been that were written some years ago and are important to read again, but one that I'd like to point you to is The Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Lure of Authoritarianism, a remarkably important book right now. And thank you for joining us.